Ruth's hands shook as she bundled the last child into the wagon, her husband's angry shouts echoing from the house behind them. The oldest girl, 14-year-old Sarah, clutched the baby while corralling the middle children into the wagon bed. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she counted heads in the darkness. 13. All 13 children accounted for, though none of them bore her blood. Her husband had collected them over the years from orphan trains, claiming charity while working them like animals in his fields. Ruth had tried to protect them, taking beatings meant for small bodies, mending their clothes in secret, saving scraps of food for the hungry ones. Tonight, when his fists had sent her crashing into the table, something inside her had finally broken free. She'd waited until his drunken snores filled the house, then woken each child with a finger to her lips. They'd moved like ghosts, these children who'd learned to be silent. Now the wagon groaned under their weight as Ruth snapped the reins, urging the old mare forward. The March wind bit through her thin shawl, and she had no clear destination beyond a way. The mountain pass seemed safer than the town road where he'd surely follow. Sarah pressed close to her side as they climbed higher into darkness. The younger ones huddled together in the wagon bed, the oldest boys trying to shield the little girls from the wind. Ruth's face throbbed where he'd struck her. Her ribs ached, but she kept the mare moving. Freedom tasted like ice and fear, but it tasted like hope too. The first snowflakes fell an hour into their climb, soft and deceiving. Within minutes, the storm thickened into a white wall. The mare balked, tossing her head, and Ruth felt the wagon wheel catch on something. The crack of splitting wood made her stomach drop. She climbed down to find the rear axle broken. The wheel canted at an impossible angle. The children stared at her with wide eyes, waiting for her to fix this like she'd fixed everything else. But Ruth had nothing left. No tools, no shelter, no plan beyond this desperate flight. The wind howled through the pass, and the temperature plummeted. She pulled the children from the wagon, gathering the youngest against her, trying to shield them with her body. Sarah and the older boys formed a circle around the little ones. They were going to die here, Ruth realized with strange calm. She'd saved them from one fate only to deliver them to another. The baby whimpered against her chest, and she hummed something tuneless, some scrap of comfort. She didn't pray. God had never answered before. The cold crept into her bones, and her eyes grew heavy despite her fight to stay alert. The children's shivering slowed, which terrified her more than the storm. Then, through the white chaos, she saw it. A flicker of orange light in the distance, warm and impossible. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. The light grew brighter, closer, and she heard a man's voice calling through the wind. Strong arms lifted her, and she tried to fight, tried to protect the children, but darkness pulled her under like deep water. Ruth woke to warmth and the smell of pine, a broad-shouldered stranger tending a fire while her children slept in blankets around her. Panic seized her chest and she bolted upright, immediately searching for the children. They were there, all 13 of them, scattered across a large cabin floor wrapped in furs and quilts. The baby slept in a crude cradle near the hearth. The youngest ones were actually clean, their faces scrubbed of trail dust. The stranger turned from the fire and Ruth scrambled backward on the low cot where she'd been lying. He was tall and rough-hewn, with dark hair pulled back and several days of beard shadowing his jaw. His clothes were leather and wool, practical and worn. He held up both hands, palms out, and stopped moving. His voice came low and even, the kind of tone used for spooked animals. He told her his name was Wicasa, that he'd found them in the pass near Frozen, that the storm was still raging outside. He nodded toward the children and said he'd given them stew and warm milk, checked them for frostbite, bedded them down safe. Ruth's eyes darted to the door, calculating distance and impossibility. Wicasa followed her gaze and shook his head slowly. He said the storm would last days, that nothing was moving in this weather, that she and the children were safe here. The word safe made her flinch. Men who promised safety were liars in her experience, but the children were warm and fed and sleeping peacefully, which meant he'd already done more than most. She forced herself to look at him properly. His eyes were dark and steady, patient in a way that unsettled her. No anger simmered there, no calculation. He moved to the fire and poured something from a pot, brought it to her slowly, set it on the floor within reach rather than handing it to her directly. Coffee, strong and bitter, and exactly what her shaking hands needed. He returned to the far side of the cabin, giving her space, and began working on something at a rough-hewn table. The baby stirred and Ruth moved to the cradle on instinct, scooping the child up before any cry could wake the others. The infant settled against her immediately, making small, contented sounds. When she looked up, Wukasa was watching her with something like understanding in his expression. He said he had a sister once, long dead now, who'd had that same way of moving toward crying babies before the cry even came. Ruth didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She studied the cabin while the baby dozed against her shoulder. One large room with a sleeping loft above, solid walls chinked tight against wind, a stone fireplace that radiated heat, shelves lined with supplies, cured meat hanging from rafters, everything spare but sufficient. A trapper's cabin, she guessed, or a hunter's. Isolated and remote, which meant no neighbors to hear screams. She forced the thought away. The man had saved them, fed her children, asked nothing. Sarah stirred and sat up, immediately alert the way she'd learned to be. Her eyes found Ruth first, then swept the cabin, landing on Wukasa. Ruth saw her daughter's shoulders relax fractionally when the man smiled and nodded a greeting but made no move toward her. He told Sarah there was cornbread and preserves on the table if she was hungry, that her mama was awake and well. Sarah looked to Ruth for permission, received a small nod, and carefully approached the food. The other children began waking in ripples, and Wukasa let them come to awareness slowly, speaking quietly to each one, pointing out the privy out back, the water pump, the food available. He moved around them like water around stones, present but not imposing. Ruth watched him with the oldest boy, showing him how to bank the fire properly, praising his quick understanding, watched him with the middle girls, answering their shy questions about the animal pelts on the walls, watched him lift the toddler who'd wandered over and set her gently back with her sisters. No impatience, no rough handling, no rage simmering beneath courtesy. The storm screamed outside, and Ruth held her coffee with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. Wukasa returned to his work at the table, carving something from a piece of cedar, and the cabin filled with small domestic sounds. Children whispering, the fire crackling, wind howling impotently against solid walls. He glanced up and met her eyes across the room. "Storm's lasting 3 days," he said quietly. "You're safe here." Ruth didn't believe him, but she desperately wanted to. Ruth flinched when Wukasa reached past her for firewood and hated herself for it. He'd done nothing to warrant her fear, but her body remembered what her mind tried to forget. Every male movement triggered that instinctive recoil, the bracing for impact that had kept her alive for 7 years. Wukasa simply stepped back, pointed to the wood he needed, and waited for her to hand it to him instead. That small accommodation made her throat tight. The first full day in the cabin revealed patterns. Wukasa rose before dawn and had the fire built high before the children woke. He set out food without ceremony and let them serve themselves, never hovering or demanding thanks. The older boys gravitated toward him with questions about the tools hanging on the walls, the processes of trapping and tanning, the mechanics of surviving alone in the mountains. He answered everything with patience, demonstrating techniques with his hands, letting them try and fail and try again without criticism. Ruth watched from her corner while pretending to mend clothes that didn't need mending. She cataloged every interaction, searching for signs of the monster she knew men could become. But Wukasa never raised his voice. never grabbed roughly, never invaded the space of children who shied away. When the 6-year-old boy accidentally knocked over a cup of water, Ruth tensed for the explosion of anger. Instead, Wicasa handed the child a rag and showed him how to wring it out properly, turning the mistake into a lesson. The afternoon brought a new test when 2 of the middle children began fighting over a wooden horse carved from pine. Their shouts brought Ruth halfway across the room before Wicasa's low voice cut through the noise. He separated them gently, crouched to their level, and asked each child to explain without interrupting the other. Then he went to his workbench and began carving a second horse, involving both children in choosing what color mane it should have. The fight dissolved into collaboration. Ruth sat back down slowly, her heart still racing from prepared intervention. Sarah appeared at her elbow with a cup of weak tea, and Ruth took it gratefully. Her daughter was watching Wicasa too, her young face serious and assessing. They'd both learned to read men for survival, to gauge mood and threat level, to predict violence before it arrived. But this man provided nothing to read. His temperament remained steady as stone, his movements predictable and calm. When the baby fussed, he brought the child to Ruth without being asked. When the toddler grew overtired and cranky, he simply picked her up and walked her around the cabin, humming something low and rhythmic until she settled. The older girls whispered among themselves, shooting glances at the strange man who'd taken them in. Ruth heard fragments of their conversation, comparisons to their previous life, tentative hope in their voices. She wanted to warn them not to trust too easily, but she also wanted to let them have this moment of peace. As evening approached, Wicasa enlisted the older boys in repairing Ruth's broken wagon wheel. He'd brought it in from the past that morning while the family slept. He showed them how to splice the cracked spoke, how to reinforce the joint, how to test the integrity of the repair. The boys worked with fierce concentration, and Ruth realized they were starved for this kind of attention. Her husband had worked them like mules but taught them nothing, keeping them ignorant and dependent. Night fell, and the storm continued its assault on the mountain. Wicasa prepared a stew of rabbit and root vegetables, the older girls helping under his quiet instruction. The cabin filled with savory steam, and the children gathered around the long table he'd built years ago for a family he'd never had. Ruth took the seat at the far end, the baby on her lap, and watched her borrowed children eat their fill. No one grabbed food or hoarded portions. There was enough for everyone, and they were learning to trust that. After the meal, Wicasa brought out more cedar pieces and taught the boys to carve. He gave the girls scraps of soft leather and showed them basic stitching patterns. The littlest ones played with wooden animals on the floor while the baby dozed in Ruth's arms. The scene was so painfully domestic that Ruth had to look away. This wasn't real. This was a storm-bought interlude, a brief respite before reality returned. When bedtime came, Wicasa climbed to the loft that served as his sleeping space, leaving the main room to Ruth and the children. Before disappearing, he pointed out the rifle by the door and told Ruth it was loaded, and she was welcome to it if it made her feel safer. The offer was so unexpected that Ruth couldn't formulate a response. He simply nodded and withdrew, giving her the power in this strange situation. The children settled into their nests of blankets and furs, their breathing evening out into sleep. Ruth sat awake by the dying fire, the rifle across her lap, watching the loft for movement that never came. Soft snores drifted down after a while, genuine sleep rather than feigned. The oldest girl's voice came soft in the darkness. "Mama," she whispered, "he's not like Papa." Ruth had no answer for that truth, so she simply stroked her daughter's hair until the girl slept, and wondered what price would eventually be demanded for all this unexpected kindness. The baby cried through the second night, and Ruth braced for anger that never came. The infant had been restless since the cold journey, feverish and miserable, refusing to settle despite Ruth's best efforts. She walked the cabin floor in the darkness, humming and swaying, trying to soothe the wailing child without waking the others. The older children had learned to sleep through anything, but Ruth still tried to muffle the sound against her shoulder. She didn't hear Wicasa descend from the loft, just suddenly felt his presence in the darkness. Her body went rigid, but he stopped several feet away, his voice barely above a whisper. He asked if he could help, said he had some willow bark that might ease whatever ailed the baby, that he'd raised orphaned wolf cubs and colicky calves, and the principle was similar enough. The offer was so matter-of-fact that Ruth found herself nodding before caution could intervene. He moved to his shelves and began preparing something by firelight, brewing a weak tea from stripped bark. While it steeped, he approached slowly, hands visible, and asked if he could hold the baby. Everything in Ruth screamed to refuse, to keep the child close, to trust no man with something so fragile. But her arms ached and her body swayed with exhaustion, and the baby's cries had grown hoarse and desperate. She handed over the infant with trembling hands. Wicasa took the child with surprising gentleness, supporting the small head properly, tucking the baby against his broad chest. He began to walk a slow circuit of the cabin, his steps measured and rhythmic, humming that same low tune he'd used on the toddler. The baby's cries hitched and stuttered, confused by the change. When the tea had cooled enough, Wicasa dipped his finger in it and let the baby suck the moisture, just a taste to test tolerance. The infant didn't reject it, so he tried a bit more, patient and careful. Gradually the crying diminished to whimpers, then to silence. Ruth stood frozen by the fireplace, watching this strange man tend her child with more care than the baby's own father had ever shown. Wicasa continued his walking and humming, and the baby's breathing evened out into sleep. He didn't immediately return the child to Ruth. Instead, he nodded toward the cot where she'd been sleeping and suggested she rest while she could. Ruth wanted to argue, to reclaim the baby, to maintain control over this one thing, but exhaustion pulled at her bones, and Wicasa's expression held no demand, only pragmatic kindness. She lowered herself onto the cot, intending to stay alert, to watch and guard. Sleep took her within minutes. When she woke, pale dawn light filtered through the cabin's small windows. The storm had quieted to intermittent gusts. Ruth's first panicked thought was for the children, but they were all accounted for, still sleeping in their nests. Her second thought was for the baby. She found Wicasa in the rocking chair near the fire, the infant still asleep against his chest, his own head tilted back in exhausted sleep. One large hand remained curved protectively around the baby's back. The tableau struck something deep in Ruth's chest, some emotion she couldn't name. She approached quietly and saw the dark circles under Wicasa's eyes, evidence of a sleepless night spent walking and soothing. He'd given her the gift of rest at the cost of his own. As if sensing her presence, Wicasa's eyes opened. He blinked slowly, orienting himself, then carefully transferred the sleeping baby to Ruth's arms. The infant barely stirred, the fever broken, breathing easy now. Wicasa stood and stretched, joints cracking, and moved to rebuild the fire. Ruth sank into the rocking chair he'd vacated, still warm from his body, and watched him work. She should thank him, she knew, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she asked why he lived alone up here, so far from everything. His hands stilled on the firewood for a moment. Then he continued his work and told her his story in pieces. He'd been a scout for the army years back, had seen things that made him weary of civilization and his violence. He'd inherited this land from a trapper who'd taken him in as a boy, taught him to survive in the mountains, to live quietly and simply. He'd built this cabin with his own hands, intending to find a wife and fill it with children. But the right woman never came, and he'd made his peace with solitude. Until now, he added, glancing at the sleeping children scattered around his floor, he'd forgotten how alive a house could feel with young ones in it. Ruth studied his profile in the growing light. He wasn't young, she realized. Lines marked his face, gray threaded his dark hair. He'd lived enough to understand suffering, enough to choose kindness despite it. That frightened her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she understood, and could predict. This gentle patience was foreign territory. The older children began to wake, and Wukasa started breakfast preparations without fanfare. Ruth remained in the rocking chair with the baby, watching him move around the kitchen space he'd designed for a family he'd never had. He involved the children who wanted to help, teaching them to measure cornmeal for Johnny cakes, to test the griddle's heat, to flip without burning. The cabin filled with cooking smells and children's voices, tentative laughter beginning to emerge. After they'd eaten, Wukasa asked if Ruth knew where she'd been heading when the wagon broke. She admitted she hadn't known, just away from her husband and toward anything else. He nodded as if this made perfect sense, then told her the nearest town was 40 miles down the mountain, that the wagon would hold together for the journey once the storm passed, that he'd provision them for the trip if that's what she wanted. The if hung in the air between them. Ruth looked around the cabin at her children, warm and fed and safer than they'd been in years, looked at the man who'd asked nothing of her except the chance to help. She should want to leave, to reclaim independence, to prove she could survive without male protection, but the baby dozed peacefully in her arms for the first time in days, and the older ones were learning useful skills. And for the first time since her wedding day, Ruth felt the possibility of rest. She told Wukasa she'd think on it, and he simply nodded, asking nothing more, giving her the dignity of choice. "Spring's coming soon," Wukasa said, and Ruth's heart sank, though she'd known this moment would arrive. 3 weeks had passed since he'd found them in the snow, and the mountain was beginning to thaw. Icicles dripped from the cabin's eaves, and patches of brown earth emerged from the white blanket. The wagon stood ready in the clearing, its wheel repaired and reinforced, provisions already loaded in neat parcels. Ruth had watched him prepare their departure with quiet efficiency, and she'd said nothing because what right did she have to ask for more than he'd already given? The children sensed the change coming. They grew quieter, their games less exuberant, as if trying to make themselves small enough to keep. Sarah had stopped smiling 3 days ago when Wukasa began the provisioning in earnest. The older boys worked with grim determination on the tasks he set them, memorizing every lesson as if it might have to last a lifetime. Even the baby seemed fussier, sensing the adult's tension. Wukasa called Ruth outside that morning while the children ate breakfast. The sun was bright on the snow, painful to look at directly, promising warmth that felt like betrayal. He stood by the wagon and Ruth joined him, keeping careful distance between them as she always did. He didn't preamble or soften it. He said the pass would be clear enough for travel within a week, that he'd guide them down to the town himself, see them settled safe. He'd put together enough supplies for 2 months if they were careful, and he'd written a letter to a boarding house keeper he knew who might give Ruth work. His voice was steady and practical, planning her future like he'd planned everything else. Ruth nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Then Wukasa did something unexpected. He asked if she wanted to go, not whether she was ready or when she planned to leave, but whether she wanted to. Ruth stared at him, confused by the question. She had to leave, didn't she? She couldn't stay here forever, imposing on his charity, filling his cabin with other people's children. He met her eyes and said she could stay if she wanted. He'd been thinking on it, he admitted, and the cabin had a good southern exposure for another building. He could put up a second structure, a family cabin close enough for safety but far enough for privacy. He'd help her build it, teach her and the older children how to maintain it. She could have her own space, her own life, but the proximity of help if she needed it. The children could stay, learn what he could teach them about mountain living. He asked nothing in return, he clarified, just offered it as a possibility if the alternative didn't suit her. The offer was so far beyond anything Ruth had imagined that she couldn't process it. Her mind raced through implications and suspicions. What did he want? What would he expect? Men didn't give without taking, didn't offer without demanding payment. But 3 weeks of observation had shown her no evidence of ulterior motives, no signs of the beast she kept waiting to emerge. Wukasa seemed to read her silence accurately. He said she should take time to think on it, talk it over with the older ones who had opinions worth considering. If she decided to go, he'd see her settled safe in town with no hard feelings. If she decided to stay, he'd start on the new cabin come spring. Either way, she had a week before the pass cleared. He didn't need an answer before then. Ruth's voice came out hoarse when she finally spoke. She asked why he'd do this, why he'd offer so much to strangers who'd brought nothing but burden. Wakasa looked away across the melting snow, his expression distant. He said he'd lived alone for 15 years and he'd told himself he preferred it that way, but having the cabin full of life these past weeks had reminded him what he'd given up. He wasn't asking her to fill that gap, he clarified quickly. He wasn't seeking a wife or a ready-made family. He just thought maybe they could be neighbors, help each other through the hard seasons, build something better than isolation. If she wanted, always, if she wanted. Ruth returned to the cabin in a daze. Sarah looked up from washing dishes, read something in her mother's face, and came to her immediately. Ruth pulled her oldest daughter close and told her what Wakasa had offered, watching Sarah's eyes widen with hope she'd been trying to suppress. The other children gathered as word spread, and Ruth laid out the choice plainly. They could go to town, try to make a life there among strangers, or they could stay here, build a cabin of their own, learn to survive in these mountains with Wikasa's help. She told them honestly that she didn't know which was right, that she was afraid of both options for different reasons. The older children discussed it among themselves while the younger ones played, oblivious to the weight of the decision. The boys argued for staying, citing all the skills they were learning, the safety of isolation. The girls were more divided, some wanting the possibility of school and church in town, others having grown attached to the mountain's peace. Sarah, as eldest, spoke last. She said she'd follow whatever Ruth decided, but she'd felt safer these past weeks than any time she could remember. The mountain was harsh but honest, and the man who'd taken them in had proven himself through actions rather than words. If Mama thought they could trust him, Sarah was willing to try. Ruth sat with the baby in the rocking chair that night after the children slept, watching firelight dance across log walls. Wakasa had retreated to the loft as always, giving her space to think. She catalogued her fears systematically. Fear of accepting help that would be withdrawn. Fear of building hope that would be crushed. Fear of the inevitable moment when kindness revealed its price. But under the fear ran a deeper current. The exhaustion of running, of looking over her shoulder, of never resting. The weight of keeping 13 children alive and whole without resources or support. The bone-deep weariness of doing everything alone. And beneath even that, something she barely dared acknowledge, the smallest seed of want. Not for rescue or protection, but for partnership, for shared burden, for the possibility that life could be more than mere survival. When dawn came, Ruth knew her answer. She'd ask for time, through spring and into summer. If Wakasa's offer held steady through the work of building a second cabin, through the reality of having neighbors rather than guests, then maybe she'd believe it was real. Maybe she'd stop waiting for the cost to be revealed and start accepting the gift for what it appeared to be. The decision settled in her chest like a stone in still water. Not peaceful exactly, but solid. She'd stay, at least for now, and see what grew from this strange mercy. "We want to stay, Mama," the oldest girl said, and 12 heads nodded in agreement. Ruth had gathered the children that evening to hear their thoughts properly, wanting to give them voice in the decision that would shape all their lives. She'd expected division, argument, the chaos that usually came when 13 opinions collided. Instead, she found rare unanimity. Sarah spoke for the older ones, explaining their reasoning with the practicality of a girl forced to grow up too fast. The mountain was hard but predictable, she said. Weather and seasons followed patterns you could learn. Mr. Wakasa taught them useful things without meanness, showed them how to do rather than just demanding it be done. He'd never raised a hand to any of them, never shouted, never made them feel worthless. That alone was worth more than any town could offer. The middle children echoed this sentiment in simpler terms. They liked learning to carve and tan hides and identify animal tracks. They liked having enough food and not fighting over scraps. They liked that nobody hit them here. The little ones just said they wanted to stay with Mr. Wakasa and the warm cabin and the wooden animals he carved for them. Even the baby, barely old enough to have an opinion, seemed to vote for staying by reaching toward Wakasa whenever he entered the room. Ruth listened to each child, hearing not just their words but the hope underneath. These children had been shuffled and sold and used as unpaid labor for years. Her husband had acquired them one by one from orphan trains, promising each a home while delivering only servitude. They'd learned not to trust adult promises, not to hope for better. Yet here they were, hoping anyway. Wakasa had been outside giving them privacy for the discussion, but he came in now with an armload of firewood. The children's conversation didn't pause, which told Ruth how comfortable they'd become around him. The 6-year-old boy ran up to tug on Wakasa's sleeve, announcing solemnly that they'd voted to stay if Mama said yes. Wakasa's expression did something complicated. He set down the wood and crouched to the boy's level, asking if he was sure. The child nodded vigorously and launched into an explanation about how he wanted to learn to track rabbits and maybe have a dog someday. Wakasa listened with full attention, then ruffled the boy's hair gently and said those seemed like good reasons to him. He stood and met Ruth's eyes across the cabin, and she saw the question there. She'd been the one holding back, the one afraid to trust this gift. But her children had already chosen, and they deserved for her to be brave enough to choose with them. She told Wakasa they'd like to take him up on his offer if it still stood. Stay through spring and summer, build the cabin, learn what they needed to know. His face didn't change dramatically, but something eased in his shoulders. He nodded and said he'd start laying foundation logs tomorrow if the weather held. The older boys immediately volunteered to help, and he accepted with the same matter-of-fact practicality he brought to everything. Just like that, the decision was made. That night, the cabin felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight of uncertainty had been pressing down on them all. The children played with more energy, laughed more freely. Sarah smiled for the first time in days. Even Ruth felt something unknot in her chest, though anxiety still lurked at the edges. She was choosing to stay, to trust, to build something in this isolated place with a man she barely knew. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, running again with no destination and dwindling resources, carried its own dangers. At least here they had a chance. After the children settled for sleep, Ruth stepped outside into the cold night air. Stars blazed overhead with an intensity impossible in town. The Milky Way a river of light across black sky. She heard the cabin door open behind her and tensed automatically, but it was only Wakasa keeping a respectful distance as always. He said he wanted her to know what the building would entail. The cabin would take most of the spring to raise properly, and she'd need to help with the work. It wouldn't be easy or comfortable, and there'd be days she'd question the decision. But he'd teach her every step, make sure she could maintain and repair it herself. The cabin would be hers, he emphasized, not his. Her space, her rules. He'd help build it, and then he'd step back. Ruth asked what he got out of this arrangement because she still couldn't understand the equation. Wakasa was quiet for a long moment, his breath misting in the cold air. Finally, he said he got to not be alone anymore, got to be useful, got to see children learning and growing instead of just his own aging reflection. He got neighbors who might share a meal now and then, who might call if they needed help, who might make this mountain feel less like exile and more like home. It was a fair trade as he saw it. Companionship without demands, community without strings. Ruth studied his profile in the starlight. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that people could be this straightforward. Her experience argued against it, but 3 weeks of evidence supported his claim. She made a decision then, standing in the freezing night under impossible stars. She'd take him at his word until he proved otherwise. She'd work beside him to build her cabin, teach her children to survive here, and create the kind of life her husband had never allowed her to imagine. If it fell apart, At least she'd have tried. If it didn't, she might finally know what safety felt like. She told Wakasa they had a deal, and held out her hand to shake on it the way she'd seen men do. He looked at her offered hand for a long moment, then took it carefully, his grip firm but not crushing. His hand was rough with calluses and warm despite the cold. They shook once, a contract sealed between two people who'd both learned to be wary of promises. When he released her hand and went back inside, Ruth stayed a moment longer under the stars. Inside the cabin, 13 children slept safe and warm. Tomorrow they'd start building a future, instead of just surviving the present. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She went back inside to find Wakasa banking the fire for the night. The baby stirred in the cradle, and he picked her up automatically, soothing her before the cry could fully form. The casual competence of the gesture, the gentleness in his rough hands made Ruth's chest tight. Maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth the risk of trusting. Only time would tell. But for the first time in years, Ruth had time to give. The cabin took shape log by log, and Ruth realized Wakasa was building it close enough for safety but far enough for her privacy. He'd chosen the site carefully, on a slight rise about 50 yards from his own cabin, positioned to catch the morning sun and sheltered from the worst winds by a stand of pine. Close enough that a shout would carry in emergency, far enough that daily life could unfold separately. The thoughtfulness of the placement wasn't lost on Ruth. The work was brutal and beautiful. Wakasa woke them before dawn, and they worked until the light failed, breaking only for quick meals. He taught Ruth and the older children to select logs, judge their soundness, strip bark, notch ends for tight joints. The boys learned to use an axe properly, the girls how to mix clay and moss for chinking. Everyone had a role matched to their strength and ability. Ruth's hands blistered and bled the first week. Her shoulders screamed from lifting and carrying, muscles she didn't know she had made themselves known through constant ache. But Wakasa worked beside them rather than above them, his own body straining under the labor, and that made the hardship bearable. He never asked more of them than he gave himself. By the third week, the foundation was solid, and the first wall logs were rising. Ruth could see the shape of it now, the way the structure would sit on the land, the way light would enter through the window spaces Wakasa had planned. It would be smaller than his cabin, but sufficient. One main room with a sleeping loft for the older children, space for a table and hearth, a door that would be hers to bar or open as she chose. The older boys had taken to the work with fierce pride. They measured and cut with increasing accuracy, learned to test the level of each log, understood why certain woods worked better than others. Wakasa praised good work plainly and corrected mistakes without shame. Under his instruction, they were becoming competent builders rather than just laborers. Sarah and the older girls managed the household tasks that kept everyone fed and clothed while the building progressed. They cooked, mended, minded the younger children, and still found time to learn the chinking process. Ruth watched her daughter directing the middle children with quiet authority and felt a surge of pride. Sarah would survive anything life threw at her, had already survived more than most. One evening after a particularly hard day, Ruth stood back to assess their progress. 4 walls rising, the skeleton of a roof beginning to take shape, evidence of their labor and Wakasa's skill combined. She felt a strange ownership of this structure, different from anything she'd experienced in her husband's house. This cabin was being built by her hands, with her sweat, for her future. It mattered in a way that left her breathless. Wakasa came to stand beside her, keeping his usual distance. He pointed out where the door would hang, where she'd want to position the stove he'd ordered from town, how the loft ladder should angle for safety with small children. He'd thought through every detail, she realized, considered the practical needs of a woman alone with 13 children. The structure itself was an act of respect. She asked him where he'd learned to build like this with such care and precision. He told her about the old trapper who'd raised him, a man who'd believed that anything worth doing was worth doing right. They'd built his cabin together when Wicasa was barely older than Sarah, and every log had been a lesson in patience and craftsmanship. The trapper was long dead now, but his teachings lived in these walls. That night around the fire, the younger children played while the older ones rested their aching muscles. Wicasa brought out his carving materials and the boys gathered close, working on their own small projects under his guidance. He'd given each of them a piece of soft pine to practice on, and they were creating a menagerie of crude animals and useful items. The concentration on their faces, the way they sought his approval with each small success, told Ruth these children were starved for positive male attention. Her husband had given them only demands and violence. Wicasa gave them skills and patient encouragement. The transformation was visible week by week. One of the middle girls had started following Ruth more closely during the building work, asking questions about how to judge if a log was sound, why certain joints held better than others. Ruth answered as best she could, passing on what Wicasa had taught her, and felt the strange pleasure of teaching rather than just protecting. These children had never had the chance to learn and grow, only to survive. Now they were flourishing. As spring deepened into early summer, the mountain transformed. Snow retreated to only the highest peaks. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows. The river that had been silent under ice now rushed and sang. The children explored their expanding world under Wicasa's supervision, learning to identify plants and track animals, understanding the rhythms of this place that might become their permanent home. Ruth found herself watching Wicasa with the children more than she watched the children themselves. The way he crouched down to show the little ones a bird's nest, carefully not touching so the mother would return. The way he let the 6-year-old boy help with tasks that would have been faster alone, valuing the child's confidence over efficiency. The way he answered the endless questions of curious minds without ever suggesting they should be quiet. He was teaching them that their thoughts and observations mattered, that curiosity was valuable, that they were worth the time it took to explain things properly. It was radical kindness, and it was rebuilding these children from the inside out. The cabin's frame stood complete now, roof beams in place. Soon they'd start on the roof itself, then the detailed work of making the space livable. Ruth could envision her family inside these walls, safe and warm through the coming winter. The vision felt almost possible now, almost real. She'd stopped waiting constantly for disaster, though caution still lived in her bones. That night, as she settled the younger children for sleep in Wicasa's cabin where they still resided, the baby reached toward where Wicasa sat carving by the fire. The child had started calling him Casa, unable to manage the full name, and the informal affection of it made Ruth's throat tight. He looked up and smiled at the baby, set aside his work, and came to take the child from Ruth's arms. The transfer had become routine over the weeks, this casual sharing of care. Wicasa walked the baby around the cabin, humming his wordless tune, and Ruth watched them with something like peace settling over her. They were building more than a cabin on this mountain. They were building trust, routine, the foundation of something that might become family. It terrified her still, but less than it had. Time and consistency were slowly convincing her that maybe, possibly, this gift was exactly what it appeared to be. "You're free now," Wicasa said carefully, "free of him, free of needing this marriage if you don't want it." The words hung in the warm summer air between them, and Ruth felt her world tilt. She stood in the doorway of her completed cabin, the space she'd built with her own hands over the past months now fully livable. The children were scattered across the clearing, the older ones helping the younger ones explore their new home. Everything should have felt triumphant. Instead, her chest constricted with unexpected panic. After her husband had been jailed 3 weeks ago following his final violent attempt to reclaim his property, the immediate threat was gone. Ruth was legally free, the children legally hers through the adoption papers Wicasa had helped her file. The judge had ruled decisively against a man who'd essentially enslaved orphans. Justice, for once, had prevailed. But justice had also removed Ruth's need for the protection marriage had provided. Wicasa was giving her an out, she realized. The marriage they'd entered into had been a legal shield, a way to make her and the children untouchable. He'd promised it would change nothing, that he expected nothing, that her life would remain her own. He'd kept every promise meticulously. Now he was offering to dissolve that legal tie, to give her complete independence. She should want that, Ruth knew. Freedom was what she'd risked everything to gain, but the thought of severing even the legal connection to Wicasa made her feel like she was falling. She'd spent months watching him with her children, working beside him, sharing meals and stories and the endless small moments that made up a life. She'd learned his tells, the way his mouth quirked before he smiled, the way he hummed when he was thinking through a problem, the way he always checked on the baby last thing before climbing to his sleeping loft. She'd learned that he took his coffee black, that he was patient to the point of stubbornness, that he never promised what he couldn't deliver. She'd learned that safety could be real and sustained, not just a brief reprieve before the next blow fell. And somewhere in the learning, something had shifted inside her. Ruth looked at Wicasa standing in the clearing between their two cabins, his expression carefully neutral, giving her space to decide. The morning sun caught in his dark hair, now grown longer through the summer months. His hands, rough from constant work, hung relaxed at his sides. He was offering her freedom, which was exactly what those hands had been building toward all along. Every log he'd helped her raise, every skill he'd taught her, every moment of respect and patience had been designed to make her independent, strong enough to stand alone. She could say yes, accept the annulment, remain his neighbor and nothing more. They could continue on as they had been, two separate households sharing land and occasional help. It would be clean and simple and safe. Or she could tell him the truth that had been growing in her heart like wildflowers in mountain meadows, persistent and impossible to ignore. She didn't want free of him. She wanted the opposite, which terrified her more than anything her husband had ever done. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She told Wicasa she'd been thinking about his offer, about what freedom meant. She'd run from her husband seeking freedom from violence, from fear, from the constant weight of survival. She'd found that here, built it with her own hands and his help. But she'd found something else too, something she hadn't been looking for because she hadn't known it could exist. She'd found partnership, equality, the kind of relationship where both people built each other up rather than one tearing the other down. She'd found a man who kept his promises, who respected her decisions, who cared for her children as if they mattered. She'd found someone she didn't flinch from anymore, someone whose presence made the world feel more manageable rather than more dangerous. Wicasa's expression remained carefully controlled, but she saw his throat work as he swallowed. She pressed on before courage could fail. She said she didn't want the annulment. She wanted the marriage to be real if he was willing. Not because she needed protection anymore, but because she chose him. Chose this life they were building together. Chose the possibility of love earned slowly through shared work and mutual respect. The last words seemed to unlock something in Wicasa. His careful neutrality cracked, and she saw vulnerability there, hope mixed with disbelief. He asked if she was certain because he'd never expected this, never dared hope for it. He'd built her cabin to give her freedom, taught her skills to make her independent, kept his distance to prove she was safe. He'd resigned himself to being the neighbor who'd helped once, nothing more. But if she was offering something different, something more, he wanted her to know he'd hoped for it from almost the beginning. The confession cost him something. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders. Men didn't admit want, didn't make themselves vulnerable. But Wicasa had never been like other men she'd known. He'd been honest from the start, and he was being honest now. Ruth closed the distance between them, a deliberate choice. She'd spent months keeping careful space, and he'd never violated it. Now she stood close enough to feel the heat of him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. She told him she was certain. It would take time, she admitted, to fully trust that this was real, that he wouldn't change once she committed. Her past had taught her to be cautious, but she wanted to try, wanted to build a real marriage with the man who'd shown her what partnership could look like. Wakesa raised his hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, giving her time to move away. When she didn't, he cupped her face with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. He promised he'd be patient, that they'd move at whatever pace she needed, that her comfort mattered more than his wants. He'd wait as long as it took for her to feel completely safe. Then he kissed her forehead, chaste and sweet, and Ruth felt something in her chest unfold like a flower toward sun. This was nothing like her first marriage, forced and violent. This was choice. This was partnership. This was love being built deliberately, log by careful log. The children's voices rose in excitement from the new cabin, calling for them to come see something. Wakasa stepped back, giving her space again, but he held out his hand. An invitation, not a demand. Ruth took it, feeling the calloused warmth of his palm against hers, and they walked together toward the cabin she'd built and the future she was choosing. Not running from something anymore, running toward. Ruth kissed Wakasa first, and the surprise in his eyes made her laugh and cry at once. They stood in the small meadow between the two cabins where wildflowers grew in riotous color. The children occupied in the distance with a project Wakasa had set them earlier. She'd asked for this moment alone, and he'd arranged it without question, understanding somehow that what she needed to say required privacy. She'd been planning the words for days, rehearsing how to tell him that what had started as protection had become something entirely different. But when the moment came, words seemed inadequate. So instead she closed the distance between them, rose on her toes, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief and clumsy, unpracticed, nothing like the brutal kisses her husband had forced on her. This was tentative and gentle, a question asked and answered. Wakasa went very still, as if afraid to spook her, then brought his hands up slowly to rest light on her waist. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with wonder. He asked if she was sure, and she realized he still thought she might be acting from obligation or gratitude rather than want. Ruth found her voice then. She told him she loved him, that it had crept up on her slowly through the spring and summer, through 1,000 small moments of kindness and respect. She loved the way he taught her children patience and skill, loved how he'd built her a cabin and then stepped back to let it be hers, loved that he'd offered her freedom even though she could see in his eyes that he'd hoped for something different. She loved him because he'd shown her what a good man looked like, what partnership could be when both people valued each other. The confession poured out of her like water from a spring, and she couldn't have stopped it if she'd tried. Wakasa's expression transformed through her speech, hope and joy warring with disbelief. When she finished, he pulled her close, carefully, giving her every chance to resist. She melted into him instead, feeling safe in a way that still surprised her. His arms around her were shelter, not prison. His strength was protection, not threat. He told her he'd loved her since the first week, watching her fierce protectiveness of children who weren't even hers by blood. He'd loved her courage, her resilience, the way she kept choosing to trust despite every reason not to. He'd built the second cabin as much to prove his intentions as to give her space. Every log had been a promise that he'd never trap her, never demand, never become the thing she'd fled from. He'd resigned himself to loving her from a distance if that was all she could offer, but this, her choosing him freely, was more than he'd let himself hope for. They stood wrapped together in the meadow while the mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Ruth felt his heart beating steady under her ear, felt the rise and fall of his breath, and knew bone deep that this was right. She'd run from violence into safety, But somewhere along the way, safety had become home, and protection had become love. When they finally pulled apart, Wicasa asked what she wanted to do about the marriage. It was legal, but it had never been consummated, never been real in the ways that mattered. Did she want a proper wedding? A ceremony with the children present to mark the change? Ruth considered, then shook her head. She said they'd already built their marriage day by day, choice by choice. The legal papers were just catching up to the reality they'd created. But she wanted one thing changed. She wanted him to move into the main cabin with her and the children, wanted to wake up next to him, wanted the children to see what a real partnership looked like. Wicasa agreed with that slow smile she'd come to treasure. They walked back toward the cabins hand in hand, and the children looked up from their project to see them approaching. Sarah's eyes went wide, then her face split into a grin. The other children caught on quickly, the older ones nudging each other and smiling, the younger ones simply happy that the adults seemed happy. That night, Wicasa moved his essential belongings to the main cabin while the children watched with poorly suppressed excitement. He'd kept so little for himself over the years that it took only 2 trips. Ruth directed him to hang his coat next to hers by the door to put his few books on the shelf she'd left empty without quite knowing why. The baby reached for him, and he took her naturally, settling into the rocking chair that had become as much his as Ruth's. The domesticity of it, the rightness, made Ruth's throat tight. Later, after the children were bedded down, Ruth and Wicasa sat together by the fire in the cabin she'd built. He asked permission before putting his arm around her, and she gave it gladly, tucking herself against his side. They talked quietly about the future, about expanding the garden, about teaching the older boys more advanced trapping skills, about getting the girls access to books for their education. They planned like partners, each voice equal, each opinion valued. When exhaustion finally pulled at them, they climbed to the loft that would now be theirs together. Wicasa had strung a curtain for privacy from the children below, another small thoughtfulness. He asked her again if she was certain, if this was truly what she wanted, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. Ruth answered by reaching for him, by choosing intimacy for the first time in her life rather than enduring it. He was gentle and patient, attentive to every signal, making sure each step was something she wanted rather than something she permitted. It was nothing like her experience of marriage had been before. This was mutual and tender, a conversation in touches and breathless affection. This was love made physical, and it felt like healing. Afterward, wrapped in his arms in the darkness, Ruth felt tears slip down her cheeks. Wicasa noticed immediately, tension flooding his body as he asked if he'd hurt her, if she was all right. She assured him through quiet sobs that she was more than all right. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of finally understanding what intimacy was supposed to feel like when both people cared for each other. He held her while she cried, stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances. When the tears passed, Ruth felt lighter than she had in years. She'd carried so much fear and trauma for so long, and some of it was finally releasing its grip. She told Wicasa she'd never known marriage could be like this, partnership and care and genuine affection. He promised her it would always be like this between them, that her comfort and happiness were his priority, that they'd build this marriage the same way they'd built the cabin, with patience and care and mutual respect. As she drifted towards sleep in the safety of his arms, Ruth thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd run into a snowstorm with 13 children and no hope, expecting to die in the cold. Instead, she'd found life, found love, found the kind of family that was built by choice rather than blood or legal obligation. The mountain had seemed harsh and unforgiving when she'd first arrived, but it had become home. And the man who'd saved her from the storm had saved her in deeper ways too, showing her that strength could be gentle and that love could be earned through consistent kindness rather than demanded through force. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, the endless tasks of survival in this isolated place. But tomorrow would also bring shared meals and children's laughter and the quiet joy of building a life with someone who valued her. Ruth had everything she needed right here, in this cabin, with this man and these children who'd become truly hers. She'd run from her husband's fists and found something she hadn't known to look for. She'd found home. The new schoolhouse needed a teacher, and Ruth raised her hand before fear could stop her. The town had grown in the years since she'd married Wikasa. More families settling in the mountain valleys. Enough children to warrant a proper school. The circuit preacher, who visited quarterly, had asked if anyone could teach basics, reading and arithmetic and writing, until they could afford to bring in a trained teacher from back east. Ruth's hand went up almost of its own accord, then trembled there, while everyone turned to look at her. She'd been educated before her first marriage, had loved books and learning before her husband had beaten that frivolity out of her, or tried to. Sitting in the small church that doubled as a town hall, surrounded by neighbors who'd come to know her as Wikasa's capable wife, Ruth realized the love of learning hadn't died. It had just been waiting for safety enough to resurface. Wikasa's hand found hers under the table, a brief squeeze of support, then released. He wouldn't speak for her or make the decision. That was hers to make. Ruth's voice came out stronger than expected when she said she'd be willing to try if the town would have her. The preacher beamed, and several of the mothers nodded approvingly. Just like that, Ruth became the teacher. The schoolhouse was built in 6 weeks through community effort, Wikasa and the older boys contributing labor alongside the other men. It was a simple structure, one room with a wood stove and rough benches, but it had windows that let in light and a good strong door. Ruth walked through it the day before classes were set to begin, trailing her fingers over the desks, imagining the space filled with young minds. Her own children would be among the students. Sarah and the older ones were hungry for education, and even the middle children were excited about proper schooling. The youngest would stay home with the baby for now, but their time would come. That first day of teaching, Ruth stood before a classroom of 20 children ranging from 5 to 15 years old, including 7 of her own. Her hands shook as she held the primer, and for a moment the old fear rose up. What if she failed? What if they laughed at her? What if she wasn't good enough? Then she looked at Sarah in the front row, her daughter's face bright with encouragement, and at Wikasa standing in the doorway for just a moment before heading to his day's work. He met her eyes and nodded once, that simple gesture that said he believed in her. Ruth began to teach. The words came haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. She'd forgotten how much she loved this, the moment when a child's face lit with understanding, the satisfaction of explaining something clearly, the joy of opening doors to new worlds through books. By the end of that first day, she was exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. She walked home to find Wikasa had started dinner. The older boys were doing evening chores, and the little ones were playing quietly. He looked up when she entered, and she must have been glowing because his whole face softened. He asked how it went, and she told him everything, the words tumbling over each other in her excitement. Some children were quick learners, others would need patience. One boy could barely read, but had a gift for numbers. 2 girls were so hungry for stories they'd stayed after to ask for book recommendations. It had been terrifying and wonderful, and she couldn't wait to do it again tomorrow. Wikasa listened while finishing the meal prep, asking questions that showed he understood what this meant to her. When she wound down, he said quietly that he was proud of her, not for succeeding, but for having the courage to try despite her fear. That was real strength, he said, doing the thing that scared you because it mattered. That night, after the children were in bed, Ruth sat with her lesson plans while Wikasa carved nearby. The comfortable domesticity of it struck her anew. A year ago, she'd been broken and terrified, running with children who weren't hers from a man who tried to destroy her. Now she was a teacher, a wife to a good man, a mother to 13 thriving children. She owned property, had skills, had purpose beyond mere survival. She'd built a life rather than just enduring one. The mountain ranch had grown too. Wikasa's trap lines brought in steady income, and they'd started raising chickens and a few goats. The garden had been expanded with help from all the children, and Ruth's preserves were becoming known in town. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were secure. The children had transformed over the year. The older boys were strong and capable, learning ranching and trapping skills that would serve them well. The girls were becoming educated young women with prospects beyond what orphan-trained children usually received. The middle ones were thriving with structure and kindness, their personalities emerging now that survival wasn't their only concern. Even the baby, now a toddler, was healthy and happy, calling both Ruth and Wicasa Mama and Papa without distinction. Sarah, nearly 16 now, had grown into a remarkable young woman. She helped Ruth with teaching sometimes, had a gift for connecting with the younger students. She'd also caught the eye of one of the neighbor boys, a decent young man from a good family. Wicasa had already started vetting him with the protective instincts of a father, which made Ruth smile. These children she'd saved had become truly hers, and Wicasa treated them as his own. One evening, Ruth found Wicasa outside staring up at the stars, something he did when he was thinking deeply. She joined him, and he pulled her close against the autumn chill. He told her he'd been thinking about the future, about the children growing up and moving on to their own lives. The oldest boys would likely start their own ranches or trap lines in a few years. Sarah might marry if she chose. The cabin they'd built would feel empty as the children left one by one. But that was good, he said. They'd raise these children to be independent, to have choices, to build lives on their own terms. That was the point. Ruth agreed, though the thought of the children leaving brought a pang. They'd become her purpose for so long that she wasn't sure who she'd be when they no longer needed her. Wicasa seemed to read her thoughts. He said she'd still be Ruth, teacher and wife and woman of strength. They'd fill their lives with new purposes, maybe help other families in need, maybe take in more children who needed a home, or maybe they'd just enjoy the peace of growing old together. Whatever came, they'd face it as partners. The conversation turned to lighter topics, plans for the upcoming winter, supplies that needed laying in, which children needed new boots, the practical discussions of a life fully lived and shared. Later, in their bed in the loft, Wicasa held her and Ruth reflected on how far she'd come. From a woman who flinched at every movement to one who initiated intimacy freely. From someone who trusted no one to someone who'd built a marriage on mutual respect. From a victim to a survivor to someone who was thriving. She traced the scar on Wicasa's shoulder, a mark from his earlier life that he'd explained one night in quiet confession. They both carried scars, visible and invisible, but they learned to carry them together. That made all the difference. When she told him she loved him, his arms tightened around her and he whispered it back. Not the desperate need of early infatuation, but the deep, steady love of two people who'd chosen each other daily for over a year and would keep choosing each other for whatever time they had. As Ruth drifted toward sleep, she felt gratitude wash over her. For the storm that had forced her to Wicasa's door, for his kindness that had made her want to stay, for the courage she'd found to build a new life, for 13 children who'd become her family, for a man who'd shown her what love actually meant. She'd run from her husband's fists and found everything she'd never dared to dream of. The mountain had become home. The cabin she'd built had become shelter. And the man who'd given her choice had become her heart. Snow fell soft on the mountain as Ruth stood in the doorway of the home she'd built with her own hands and heart. 3 years had passed since that desperate flight through the storm, and sometimes Ruth had to remind herself that this life was real and not some fever dream conjured in the frozen pass. The cabin had weathered 2 winters now, solid and warm, proof of good construction and patient teaching. Beyond it, Wicasa's original cabin still stood, but they'd converted it into a workshop and storage space. This cabin, the one she'd helped raise log by log, was home. The clearing between the buildings was covered in fresh snow, unmarked except for the tracks of chickens and the path they'd worn between cabin and barn. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of baking bread. Inside, the sounds of family filled the space, children's voices raised in some debate, the baby's laughter, the creak of the rocking chair. Ruth's first wedding anniversary was tomorrow. Not the anniversary of the legal marriage forced by necessity, but the anniversary of the day they'd chosen to make it real. Wicassa had asked her how she wanted to mark it, and she'd said she just wanted a quiet evening together after the children were in bed. Simple domesticity had become precious to her, something she'd never take for granted. The teaching was going well. Ruth had 23 students now, and the town had voted to pay her a small salary. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through her own skill and effort. Some of her original students were reading at advanced levels, hungry for the books Wicassa had started ordering from catalogs. She'd discovered she had a gift for teaching, for making complex ideas accessible, for nurturing curiosity. Sarah had become her assistant teacher, working with the youngest students while Ruth handled the older ones. Her daughter had also begun courting the neighbor boy in earnest, with Wicassa's grudging approval. Ruth suspected a wedding might be in their future, which brought both joy and melancholy. Her first child grown and ready to start her own life. But Sarah would stay close, the young man's family having land adjacent to their own. The pattern would likely repeat with the other children. They'd grow up, but they'd stay near, building a community on this mountain. Wicassa appeared from the barn, carrying a bucket of fresh milk, his breath misting in the cold air. He saw her in the doorway and smiled. That slow, warm expression she'd learned meant contentment. He'd aged a bit in the 3 years, more gray threading his hair, but he moved with the same steady competence. When he reached the porch, he set down the bucket and pulled her close for a kiss that still made her heart flutter. Inside, chaos reigned in the best way. The older boys were arguing about the best way to set a snare, demonstrating with string on the table. The middle girls were helping the little ones with their letters, preparing for school tomorrow. The toddler was attempting to help with the bread dough, which meant mostly spreading flour everywhere. Wicassa surveyed the scene with amusement and waded in to restore some order. Ruth watched him scoop up the flour-covered toddler and redirect the boys to take their debate outside where they could demonstrate properly. He moved through the family like a conductor through an orchestra, each small adjustment bringing harmony from cacophony. She'd chosen well, Ruth thought for the 1,000th time. Chosen this man, this life, this hard, beautiful existence on the mountain. Dinner was the usual controlled chaos of feeding 15 people, but they developed routines that worked. The older children helped serve the younger ones. Everyone contributed to cleanup, and Wicassa led the after-dinner routine of story time for the little ones while the older children did evening chores or schoolwork. Ruth watched from the kitchen, hands in dishwater, and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. This was what she'd run toward, though she hadn't known it at the time. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just survival, but joy. After the children were finally settled for sleep, Ruth and Wicassa took their customary place by the fire. He was working on a new carving, a gift for Sarah's upcoming birthday, while Ruth reviewed the next day's lessons. The comfortable silence between them was punctuated by the crack of logs in the fire and the scratch of Ruth's pencil on slate. Wicassa set aside his carving and looked at her with unusual intensity. He said he had something to tell her, and Ruth felt a flicker of concern, but his expression was soft, not worried, so she waited for him to find his words. He said that the past 3 years had been the happiest of his life, that he'd never imagined he could have this. Family and partnership and home. He'd resigned himself to solitude before she appeared, convinced himself it was enough. But she'd shown him what he'd been missing, and he was grateful every day that she'd chosen to stay. Ruth set aside her slate and moved to sit beside him, tucking herself against his side where she fit perfectly. She told him she was the grateful one, that he'd given her and the children everything they needed to not just survive but thrive. He'd shown her what a good man looked like, what real partnership meant. He asked if she was happy, his voice quiet in the fire-lit dimness. It was a question he asked periodically, as if he needed reassurance that this life met her needs, that she wasn't settling or enduring. Ruth turned to face him fully and said she was home. The word carried weight, meaning beyond simple location. Home was safety and choice and belonging. Home was waking up next to someone who valued her, teaching children who respected her, building a life that reflected her own decisions. Home was 13 children thriving, a marriage that strengthened rather than diminished her, a future that held promise instead of only fear. Home was this man who'd found her broken in the snow and helped her rebuild herself stronger. Wakasa's eyes grew suspiciously bright, and he pulled her close, pressing his face into her hair. They sat wrapped together while the fire burned low. Two people who'd both known loneliness and violence, who'd found each other in a storm and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. Outside, snow continued to fall soft and steady, blanketing the mountain in silence. The children slept safe and warm in the cabin Ruth had built. The ranch that she and Wakasa had expanded together sat ready for winter. Tomorrow would bring teaching and chores and the endless work of raising a family, but tonight was for holding on to the person who'd become her home and letting gratitude wash through her. No one had wanted her when she'd run from her husband with 13 orphans in tow. She'd been damaged goods, a woman with too much baggage, children that weren't even hers by blood. The town had turned away, the law had failed her, and she'd fled into the mountains with no plan beyond escape. But Wakasa had wanted her, or rather, he'd seen past want to something deeper. He'd seen her strength when she only felt broken. He'd seen the children's potential when others saw only burden. He'd offered help without expectation and partnership without possession. He'd given her the space to heal and the tools to build, then stepped back and let her choose her own future. And she'd chosen this, chosen him. Not because she needed rescue, but because he made her life richer. Not because she was afraid alone, but because together they were stronger. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That choice, made freely and reaffirmed daily through 3 years of shared life, was the foundation of everything good she'd built. Ruth pulled back to look at Wakasa's face in the firelight. She told him she loved him, that she'd choose him again every day for the rest of her life, that building this family and home with him was the best decision she'd ever made. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, a kiss that promised forever and meant it. When they finally climbed to the loft and settled into their bed, Ruth felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. The journey from that frozen night to this warm peace had been long and difficult, but every step had been worth it. She fell asleep in Wakasa's arms, surrounded by the quiet breathing of 13 sleeping children in the cabin she'd built on the mountain that had become home. And for the first time in her life, Ruth knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged.